Good evening and welcome to another edition of Green and Shy. This is Dan Garms with my co-host Alton Erdemir, and tonight we're fortunate enough to have Dr. Ruth Fisher, PhD, co-founder of CannDynamics. And Ruth has an incredibly interesting background. She's an economist with expertise in theoretical and applied modeling, problem solving, game theory, behavioral economics, and data analysis. So without further ado, I'd like to show you a little bit of a book that Ruth wrote that I'm just finishing that I think is excellent. It's called The Medical Cannabis Primer, Ushering in the Golden Age of Marijuana. And if you've read a lot of books on marijuana, I guarantee you haven't read a book that's this insightful with a great deal of research put into it. And before we get going here with Ruth, Ruth has a PhD from the University of Chicago, an undergrad degree from the University of Pennsylvania. And I found Ruth through one of her research reports that she wrote, and I decided to contact her through LinkedIn, connected with her, gave her a call, and we had the most incredible in-depth conversation. What I thought I knew, I've got whole new ideas on what I can know. And so let's get started. Here's Alton to tell you a little bit more about Green and Shy and what we do as a group, and then we'll get Ruth started and talk to Ruth for the next hour. So if you're tuned in, you're gonna have a great evening tonight, and you'll learn some incredible things about science around cannabis.
Thanks, Dan, and hello. Thank you for joining us again tonight. If this is the first time joining Green and Shy, you'll know that, well, you'll find out quickly that we're a platform that's created for opportunity for people to learn about the cannabis industry, find out how to get jobs or get the training they need to get jobs, start businesses, get the resources they need to support their businesses, their organizations, and make it a level playing field for everybody out there that's an enthusiast or wants to get into the industry. And that's why it's so important for us to stick together and build this community and have great people with information and thought leaders like Dr. Ruth Fisher that's here tonight. And it's exciting to have because there's some interesting things that are going out there, and we're gonna jump right into it because I think some of the things that Ruth's taking care of right now and working on is very fascinating. So I'll let Dan start off with the interview.
Ruth, you know, we've had some nice conversations leading up to this. Tell our audience how you got into this industry, writing books. It's a really interesting beginning.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me on to your program. I got into cannabis like a lot of other people. I was drawn in through a relative, my brother. He got multiple sclerosis. And multiple sclerosis for him manifests itself as pain, and he gets a lot of pain and a lot of different types of pain. And he was struggling with that. And at one point, one of his neurologists said, you know, I think maybe you could benefit from cannabis, but I really can't give you any guidance because I don't really know anything. So he got his note, which says that, you know, he essentially qualifies for medical cannabis in the state of California. And he walked into a dispensary and realized he really had no idea what he was doing. Anyone who's familiar with cannabis, who's been in a dispensary, knows that it's not your old, you know, smoking pot with a bunch of friends. So he really, you know, wanted to use it to help with his pain. He tried it, he started using it, and he found that it was working. But he knew that he still really wasn't sure what he was doing with it. I'm a researcher and I have a lot of experience in healthcare. So he pulled me in at some point and he said, you know, can you help me figure this out? So at that point, I had tried cannabis and decided it wasn't really my thing as a recreational thing. I had heard about medical cannabis that, you know, is kind of out there, but I wasn't really attuned to it. So I came in and to be honest, I was skeptical. I'm, you know, grew up in the age of this is your brain on drugs. And while I had tried it, I was skeptical that it could really be used for medical purposes. But I knew that my brother had been going on this really long journey that was really ugly and had been having a really tough time. And I said, hey, if he thinks it's going to work, then I'm just ready to put aside any biases or priors and come to this and try and figure it out and see if we can make it work for him. So that's kind of how I first came to it. And I just essentially from there just started reading. And it was fascinating. It's nothing like I had ever learned, read about before. I'm particularly good at looking at information, going into a new area I know nothing about, and reading and understanding what the key issues are and kind of pulling them together and creating a big picture. And with cannabis, I had a really difficult time doing that because it was so complex and there were so many voices with so many different perspectives. And going in, I really didn't know anything. And so I didn't realize that there were different voices, and it took me a long time to figure things out. So along the way, my brother was getting better results, and he's an engineer, and he came up with an idea to help other people kind of manage this process of finding the right product for them better than he had experienced. So we're obviously, everyone now is experimenting in medical cannabis and laying the foundation for how it's going to be used in the future. So he came up with this technology for helping individuals with particular conditions or symptoms better find cannabis products that will help their needs. And so then I started really doing research, and this went on for quite some time. And at some point, by the time I was able to really design the algorithms for the technology we were designing, my brother said, hey, we've just amassed so much information. We really should put it out there and put it in a book. And so that's what we did. So the book is structured a little differently than kind of most of what you see out there. Most people tend to come from either kind of an organic cannabis perspective, and it's a whole plant medicinal perspective, or it's a traditional healthcare perspective. And it's kind of one of those two views. And I generally look at things different than most people. So I came at it, the book reflects how I thought about it, how I think about it. And anyone who reads it will get a good understanding of how I put the pieces together to create our algorithm. So there's a lot of side-by-side tables trying to understand what the difference, so what's the difference between flower and tinctures? And, what are the differences between all of the different cannabinoids and all the different terpenes, and how do we make sense of all this? And so that was kind of my take on it. And it was funny because we had a guy who's a long time, he's really big in compassionate care, and he's done some really amazing stuff in cannabis. And he actually endorsed our book. His name is Mike Robinson. And when I met him for the first time and explained what my background was, he said, oh, that explains it. He said, I couldn't figure out where you were coming from because this is so different from anything else I've seen. So that
Mike is a thought leader too in the cannabis industry, and on LinkedIn he's got a large number of followers. So yeah. I respect him very much.
He's a tremendous person. He's done some really amazing stuff.
He has. So have you, actually. And Ruth, tell us, I think your father was a physician, correct?
He was.
Did that inspire you to get into this medical side later on as well, in addition to your brother having needs that you wanted to help with?
So my dad, he was a private practice physician. He was a pediatric ophthalmologist. And so he was an independent. He was also very much an iconoclast. And he always taught us, he would send us articles, and we would always say, Dad, just tell us what it says. And he says, no, I want you to read it for yourself. So, I don't bring any bias or anything into it. And he was very adamant about us, learning how to look things up and research and find out for ourselves. So that was really inspiring to me. He had, since he was a doctor, he had taken care of the whole family since, forever. And when anyone ever had a problem, he would always do the research and guide us through. And so growing up, we always had pretty tremendous experiences with the healthcare system because he paved the way for us. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2005, and this is before my brother started having his problems. But growing up, I would always, because of him, my dad was my idol. He was my hero. And at some point very early on, I thought about becoming a doctor, but for some reason, I don't remember now why, I decided not to. But everything I've done has always been very linked to the healthcare industry and the economics. I've done a lot in healthcare with especially technology. I'm also very interested in technology. So kind of where healthcare and technology intersect. Worked with biotech companies and doctors and a lot of startups in healthcare. So that's kind of where my background comes in. And so when my brother started having problems, since my dad was no longer here, I felt it was kind of my obligation to step up and help him if I could, because it was most natural for me out of anyone else in my family.
Well, I think what makes your background so interesting, Ruth, as a cannabis researcher is how many people, I haven't talked to anyone that not only had the scientific background, but knew how to write algorithms. And I think that's really key to collecting data and analysis information. In this industry, there's not a lot of accurate data. There's a lot of companies out there doing research, but I still find it being the wild, wild west. And a lot of it is supposedly predictive analytics. It's not so predictable. I think with your background in economics and as a quant, I think there's a lot of interesting things that can be done from your perspective. Are there anyone that's a hero to you in the cannabis research market from a scientific side in the world that inspires you, and someone that's done things that make you think they're outstanding for what they've developed or discovered?
There's so many people. One of the things, I'm constantly amazed by the people in cannabis. There are people in there, almost everyone's come in because of a personal experience they've had, and they bring so much passion and a real desire to help other people. And I've seen that with Mike. He's a tremendous individual and he's done so much, and I admire what he's done. Mara Gordon is another person who I really admire tremendously. I don't know a huge amount about her. I have met her. I've listened to a lot of her podcasts, and I think it's tremendous what she's doing, building an empire and kind of putting the pieces together in order to enable credible cannabis, credible medical cannabis. Another person who I've met and worked with a little bit, hopefully we'll be working with a little bit more, is Rob Doblé. He's working with Havas ECS, and they're doing an amazing thing in creating the ecosystem that would enable medical cannabis to be able to be accepted and really used by the traditional medical community. So they're bringing in the health insurance reimbursement, the malpractice, medical malpractice, insurance, the education system. They've created a journal. And so I was really impressed by the fact that, so I've created an ecosystem. I've written several articles on what would it take to get the system up and running better. And there's a lot of hurdles, like the fact that, for example, for most drugs, or generally speaking, physicians turn to the FDA for their education. So when the drugs are going through all their clinical trials and trying to get approval from the FDA, they're gathering all this evidence, and the FDA combs through it. And by the time the drug is approved, there's this repository of information available so that the doctors can now turn to that for guidance and understand who benefits from the drug and how to dose it properly. And with cannabis, you don't have any of this. You don't have this background of information or repository of information. So even if a doctor decides that he would like to start using cannabis or help prescribe it to his patients, he really has no guidance. And so part of what Havas is doing is creating a journal and an educated community. They have a credentialing program and kind of putting all of that together. So they're creating a community of people who are all on the same page and can serve as validators for each other. And so that's kind of one of the pieces that's now enabling people from the traditional healthcare industry to get into cannabis and actually use it.
You touched base on that malpractice word that stuck out to me because I look at risk and finance and financial stuff, and it's very interesting because I know as a pharmaceutical company is raising capital for them in the past, there's a big amount of capital that they have for risk and liability for some of those malpractice, whether it's because of side effects or any type of potential cases in the future. Whereas I think this would be a good enough cause that they should be spending some of that money towards the medical side of the cannabis plant, because if you think about it, that's a lot of money that now can be used towards something else, because you're not going to have the same type of side effects. There isn't that much that can be, done to cause the same type of chemical induced or scientifically tried, compound, as opposed to the great results that we're seeing by, isolating certain cannabinoids and different things like that. So it's interesting that, that ratio of benefit isn't there yet. I mean, have you seen anyone taking that angle?
I agree. It's definitely there. I think maybe what you can look at the costs and benefits, but based on my experience and with my dad. So if you look at like the malpractice thing, my dad, he was, of course, I'm not biased in any way. He was an amazing doctor. And he loved his patients, but he lived in fear that he would be sued. And so I think that people who are not in the industry don't understand that aspect of, how it affects doctors, and it colors everything they do. You also have this really, really important issue where if you do something and you get sued, and you may have not done anything wrong, but so suppose you get sued, if you go to court, they're going to say, well, is this a standard of care? What you did to treat the patient, is this considered within the medical community the correct standard of care to use? And if you're the first person pioneering it, they're going to say, no one uses this. And so you lose that support. And I think in healthcare, I think there will be a lot of followers, but no one wants to be the leader. And so even if, potentially there is money to be made, there's cost savings. You have a huge risk aversion by the insurance companies and the doctors and the hospitals and everyone involved in healthcare.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Ruth, because a lot of people don't realize the malpractice insurance and how it differs from state to state. And it can be very, very expensive for specific doctors.
Yeah.
Well, you're also, if you're the first one, like she said, if you're the first one to kind of take that leap, you're fighting against something that's seen in the eyes as a commodity, a drug, and a food. So it's dependent on which one of those side of the triangle they're going to approach you with. So it's kind of difficult. Right.
Yeah. And I think that's why the creating the community of doctors is so important, for them to talk to each other and feel more comfortable with it, and also to provide support and validation. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting because cannabis is definitely considered new technology, but technologies always have very strong social issues. So it's not just a matter of getting the technology out there. It's a matter of getting social acceptance for it as well.
Well, I agree. Another thing that I thought was interesting in your book is you've got so many references of the work you studied. And I thought I had all these books and sites down, and I must have found another 50 or 60 sites that were so interesting. And I haven't had a chance to go through them yet, but I saved them all. And I thought so many of them are just filled with incredible information. And I don't know how you wrote the algorithms to find that, Ruth, but I hope everyone will buy your book just for that alone, if they want to learn about the cannabis industry. And I'm not just trying to pump your book. It's a really good book, folks.
Thank you. So. Thank you. I appreciate that. I was well trained at the University of Chicago.
Great school.
Yeah, they were a real stickler for data and information and quality research. And I wanted to make sure what I was trying to do was, for me, because in cannabis, there's so much misinformation, there's so much wrong information, there's so much fraudulent information, and there's a lot of right information. And as I said, coming to it as a real newbie, I had no idea what was what. And it was really important for me, for what we were doing, to try and find the right data. And so I spent a lot of time reading a lot of different things and found a lot of not right information. And when I was able to finally find good information, that I really treasured that. And I wanted to make sure that, other people are aware of it, but also reference it and provide it for other people to essentially validate what we're trying to do here.
So how is that information being used? So a lot of our consumer base, our viewers, it's a variety of people. Some are experienced, some are cultivators, some are getting into it, and some, they want to figure out what's the difference between an indica and a sativa on the simple levels. Some want to know about the terpenes and the limonene and the chlorophyllene and all these fancy ones that have other properties like anti-inflammatory, but it's very difficult out there. I mean, there's some people that don't understand that you can have an indica, but because of the terpenes, it'll give you energy and it'll give you focus and different things like that. And, from my knowledge and, some of the classes I took, there really isn't a pure sativa or indica strain out there anymore. They've been interbred and, crossed so much. So what's that landscape look like? How easy is it going to be for the individual that just walks in there, like your brother, for instance, that walked in there and had such a diverse amount of different things? How are people going to be able to tell what they need? Is this always going to be this trial and error?
Well, yes, to some extent, because each person's different. Mm-hmm. And so while, and this is one of the things that Mara Gordon said, is she's doing the 80-20 thing, is she's trying to get her formulation so that it'll be right for maybe 80% of the population. But since people react differently, what works for me might not work for you. And so what we're trying to do is help people understand the issues behind the science and understand how everything works, so that they can start somewhere and try and move towards where they want to be going, and understand you can't move towards where you want to be going unless you understand how to do that. And what we're trying to do in the book is kind of provide the tools. And so as an example, there's a table in the book, and this provides a list of all the different cannabinoids and terpenes and the different conditions that they address. And this is also what our app is doing. So it's using this information, it's trying to distill it down, but it's a very complicated process. And I think cannabis, as I said, will always be. I think it's also very new in that we know the plant has, hundreds of different compounds. There's hundreds of cannabinoids, hundreds of terpenes. And the count depends who you talk to as far as how many exactly there are. But right now you hear maybe THC, CBD, maybe THCV, a little bit about CBG, maybe CBN, and maybe that's it. So that's like 5 compounds out of 100. And so they're going to constantly be finding new ones that are going to work. And it's the same thing with the terpenes. You hear now maybe about a half a dozen, but there's a lot more of them out there. And then there's flavonoids, and they keep finding new different ingredients in cannabis. So it's really complicated, and I don't know that it's really going to get much easier, other than by having the right tools out there, that there's so many different people providing tools to help people get to where they want to go with the genetics and with the apps like we're doing, and everything else. So I think I think most people can benefit, but if they really want to get the ideal out of it, to get the most that they can, I think they're going to need a little help.
Absolutely right. And did you hear this last week, they found, cannabidolic acid as something they can stabilize into being even a stronger compound. It's, I guess, earlier stages in the plant. It has a cannabidolic acid that goes into the cannabidiols and everything like that, but it's too unstable to do anything with. And there was an article that they can stabilize it, which they think they can. It's something that could be groundbreaking for pharmaceuticals, but who knows how long that could be, you know. It's just interesting.
Yeah.
So Ruth, another challenge, I think, you know, when we saw the first FDA approved drug with GW Pharma with Epidiolex, then the FDA came back in and said, you know, they were concerned that it wasn't replicated every time. So in the grows, is it important that cleaning takes place once you get to a point? What do you think the most important part of the scientific process of creating not only the dosing, but the replication of the plant over and over to be consistent for the patient? Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a really good question, and the consistency is one of the big issues out there, and that's when I talk to doctors, that's generally one of the first things that they bring up is, you know, you can't get the consistency like you get in regular pharmaceuticals. I think that it is important. However, I think cannabis is different from other medications in that, again, it's a personalized thing. And I think that from what I've heard, patients generally tend to be more empowered and more of a partner in their own care. Whereas in more traditional medicine, a doctor will say, here, just take this pill. And the patient just complies and takes the pill. Now it's more of a partnership about tracking symptoms and, you know, looking at the different cannabinoids and terpenes and ingredients and figuring out what's working and what's not working. And as the patient is empowered in their care and they know what's working, I think that as long as they have that knowledge, the only thing they really need is the transparency and accuracy in the labeling, so that every product they get is clearly labeled with the ingredients, so then they can adjust their dosing based on what their particular needs are. So if you need 20 milligrams and this new one is 15, well, maybe you take a little bit more. And, you know, what you need is the information in order to adjust the dose to where you need it to go. And I think that is probably as important. I mean, certainly in an ideal world, we would like more consistency. But I think as long as you have that accurate transparency of information, I think that will go a long way.
Thank you. Do you have any thoughts on when the FDA possibly removes the Schedule I status of marijuana, what that will do? Do you think they're going to come in and require more control of it to open the doors for big pharma? Or do you think that it will still be open to smaller science organizations that want to develop really good products? Because it seems the big corporations, the big pharma companies are staying away from it at this time, other than doing synthetic replications, which no one really wants. Why would you want a synthetic when you can have the natural plant?
Control and consistency.
Oh,
yeah. And I think, and this is a very good question. I think that we're at a point right now where what happens with the FDA and the whole plant versus the traditional pharma industry, kind of how that comes, plays out is going to have repercussions. I had just done an article on this, looking at comparing cannabis to penicillin. And I thought that cannabis would be the penicillin of the 21st century. And when I was reading that, I was realizing penicillin was very different from what had come before, and that in order to create penicillin, they had to pioneer a lot of new technologies. And in cannabis, they're doing the same thing. And I think that in cannabis, what they're doing is they're forcing this issue of whole plant medicine, and do we have to use purified isolates for it to be real medicine, or can we actually use compounds with products with more than one active ingredient in them? And part of the problem that you saw earlier is the chemistry and the technology and the science weren't there. So if you wanted something to go through the pharmaceutical route, you had to be able to explain the mechanism of action. And it was complex doing that for just one active ingredient. So you couldn't really work with more than one active ingredient at the same time. So everything came out as isolates. And again, it's easier to control, it's more consistent. But when AIDS started, that's when I believe they started using drug cocktails and finding out that when you use different drugs in combination with one another, you can get better effects. So they're essentially using cannabis like medications now. They call them drug cocktails, where you're using 6 different medications together, where each medication is one single isolate, whereas cannabis has all of those 6 together in one plant. And so they're using cocktails now for AIDS and for cancer and some of the more complex drugs, because they realize they're getting better effects. And I think that maybe given the technology to be able to better understand in cannabis how the different compounds are working together, I think if they can figure that out, then we can move towards more of the whole plant route. And I think that if that doesn't happen and they're not able to do that, then I think that you're going to have 2 separate fields within cannabis. You're going to have the separation where you're going to have the whole plant community, which is going to continue, but separate from the medical or traditional healthcare community, which is going to stick with the pharmaceuticals, the isolates, or the synthetics.
You know, Ruth, another question is, how do we find good science? There's so many people in the CBD industry. There's many growers that have different processes for extraction, et cetera. How do you really go out and find a reputable CBD, CBG, CBN producer? And I see so many companies buying white label products and remarketing them. I'm looking for people that are doing proprietary, interesting things that make a difference in people's lives. So where do we find quality? When half the time I have a medical card for my local dispensary, and the people there really know less probably than I do about what my needs are from just the reading that I do. So what do we tell the average person, or not tell them, but educate them on when they're going out? What do they look for?
I think one of the difficulties with cannabis is, again, it requires more effort than people are used to putting forth in their healthcare. And again, they're used to having the doctor just, give them a prescription, and they go to the pharmacy, and the pharmacist gives them their medication, and they don't have to make any decisions along the way. And they really don't need to know anything about the manufacturer of the drug or what it is, or, really anything. With cannabis, it's really different, and I think people need to educate themselves. I think that eventually, and you're starting to see this, there's going to be certification programs and different methods that are emerging now in the market to help brand and certify quality, so that at some point people are going to be able to know that, well, this company got so-and-so's seal of approval, so it must be a high quality product, and they can just look for the seal. But for now, I believe that you need to talk to people you trust, who are in the industry, who knows what's going on. If you don't know anyone in the industry, make sure you do research. I think that one of the things that's happening now is there's been a real paradigm shift away from focusing solely on strains and more towards focusing on profiles of information. And you have the certificates of analysis, which are the lab results that are associated with a particular batch of cannabis. And so different states have different requirements for labeling and providing information. Right now, as far as I know, no state requires, they almost all require lab testing. So you have these certificates of analysis out there, which is the lab test that tells you exactly what's in the sample that you're buying. However, that lab test isn't necessarily available to the consumer. However, you have a lot of companies out there who are trying to prove that they care about the customer and trying to gain a reputation for high quality and transparency of information, who are saying, we're making our certificates of analysis available. And so you can either go, some of them have like QR codes on their packaging where you can pull up the certificate of analysis, or you can go to their website and pull it up. And I would say, I mean, if you look at those, they can be really scary because there's a lot of information. I think the first thing to check is the information available? And if the company says, no, we don't make that available, then I would see that that's not a great sign. If they say, oh yes, we absolutely make everything available, that's a good sign. And so even if you don't really know too much, or if you look at the lab result and you have no idea what any of it means, the fact that they're making it available, I think shows really good faith, and that they're really trying to make an effort to be transparent to the consumer. And I think that that's what consumers should be looking for, is quality and transparency in the manufacturers, the growers and the manufacturers.
And what I've been seeing on some of them, and I think this might end up being the standard, because you can have a great lab testing from, you know, a supply or, you know, a sample, but a lot of the times it's not testing the ground that it was grown on. So it could have some great content, great percentages as far as the CBD, CPG and stuff, but some of the tests now are taking it to the next level and testing for pesticides and things like that, because you can have the greatest plant, but if it used to be an industrial site that it was grown on, well, hold on a minute, there could be something in there, right? So I think you're right. I've been seeing a lot of them. What are they, the CIO reports?
Yeah.
Right, and the QR code, I've even seen it on product. I showed Dan earlier, a new product that I'm kind of into on the CBG side. It has 500 milligrams of CBG, which is doing great stuff, and I haven't really seen that out, but they have a QR code, and I'm starting to see that on more and more products, but I'm guessing to get it regulated, and maybe you've seen this, they're gonna probably have to test more than just the spectrum.
I know in California, they require a whole list of pesticides and chemicals and heavy metals and all the different things. So I think as they haven't standardized any of the testing. Another problem they're having is they're not getting consistent test results. So you can take one sample of cannabis to 2 different labs and get 2 different test results. And so they still need to establish better protocols and standards for testing. So I got into the industry about 3.5 years ago, and they've come so far in just the 3.5 years. And so much more is available now. I think that things are moving so fast. Everyone in the industry knows about these problems. And so I think, as I said, there are enough people out there who are good people and who are really trying to help other people, who are willing to say, you know what, I'm going to make everything available. I have nothing to hide. I want to prove to you that what I'm doing is all the best, the highest quality stuff. And I want to provide you with all the right information. So again, the companies that are forthcoming, I think, are much more credible than the companies who are not providing good information on the label or not making any of their test results transparent. So I've heard that some people say, well, we're not going to tell you what's in it because that's proprietary. And it's like, well, you can't get away with that with food, because what if someone's allergic? Is it, oh, tough luck? So I think, again, when you're looking at companies, there are enough companies out there that are really pushing the standard, and they're forcing disclosure and higher quality from other companies. Now, you're always going to get, lower quality companies. All I can say is if it looks too good to be true, it probably is.
Ruth, I've interviewed a number of people that have worked at some of the major labs in different states that are legal both for recreational and for medicinal. And some of these individuals were quite disenchanted and left labs because some of the data they were asked to manipulate data falsely. So that does go on. And I'm wondering who's monitoring these, because obviously when you're having someone that's a scientist that works in a lab that's maybe at one time done cancer research, now they're doing cannabis research, and they're saying, hey, I quit this place because they were asking me to manipulate data that wasn't accurate about the plant. Have you run into that at all in California?
I've read a lot about it. Mm-hmm. And we actually have a chapter in the book on testing and discussing all of these issues and giving both honest reasons for divergences in sample results from different labs, and also nefarious reasons. part of the problem is cannabis is relatively new and it's complicated. And so you have these traditional labs out there who are out there and they were doing, say, other herbs or other pharmaceuticals, and none of them wanted to get into cannabis because that, since it's Schedule I, that would risk their other business. And so what turns out is that from what I've read, most of the cannabis labs, the labs that are out there that are testing cannabis, they're new labs. These are new guys that have popped up and are servicing only cannabis. And cannabis is new, so while they might have had equipment that they're now using for cannabis, it's not exactly the same. It's also true that there's no standard protocols. So you can follow, it's like following a recipe. If two different people give you the same ingredients but different recipes, you're going to come up with different products. And so it's not only a matter of requiring testing, but telling them there's different equipment to use and different equipment give different results. So they need to set standards for which equipment is acceptable and which protocols are acceptable. The other thing is it would really help if they enforce the law because while the laws are all out there, from what I've heard, they're just not enforcing it.
Well, it's hard in Chicago. I mean, when you have something that has really high levels of taxes, the inventory is not even there. I mean, you have to still, here it is past halfway through the year in some cases. And Dan, I think you have a medical card, so you skip the line. But for recreation, you're waiting an hour and a half to get one pre-roll. I've been there one time and I waited in line, and me and my girlfriend were there, and they said, all we have is one pre-roll per person. And with the rules here in Chicago, I had more than that on me. I mean, there's no point of sitting in line, but as that progresses, then things will change. But until then, I mean, Chicago with this pass, it's always they're always going to fight that black market. It's going to be hard to make things legal when they can't keep up with demand. And that might be something that, with cities like this, have there been any talk about indoor greenhouses, vertical greenhouses, urban greenhouses? You hear about them, but that could be a big solution.
Yes, I think part of the problem with cannabis is we've seen this in all the different states that have legalized medical and legalized recreationals. We're creating whole new infrastructure here. This is a whole new industry that's coming up, and kind of worse is that everywhere you have very well established black markets. So not only are they trying to create new legal markets, but at the same time, there's massive competition from the black markets. And that makes it really, really difficult for licensed suppliers to really, comply with everything and still make a profit. And, of course, so not all the pieces are in place. I mean, we don't realize, so you buy a new car and you don't even think about gas. You don't think about repair. You don't think about getting a license for the car because all of these pieces of the system have already been established and they're already there. So you don't have to think about it. But when you talk about cannabis, so in hemp, for example, the machinery, the decorticators are really expensive, and they don't really have them for cannabis because cannabis hasn't been grown for hemp, rather. They haven't grown hemp in the US for decades. So the equipment isn't there. So now you can harvest it, but you can't process it. And so you're seeing the same thing with cannabis. All the different pieces, and there's no banks, there's no transportation and the packaging and the labeling. You take for granted when you go into the grocery store that you get all the information in the label because that's it's been there and it's done, it's enforced, and it's well known and mature. And in cannabis, everything is new, and they're starting everything from scratch. And I think there's so many laws and there's so much compliance and there's so much backlog in everything that they don't have the manpower to do the essentials. So they don't really have the extra people to do the enforcing of testing, or, for example. And I'm not saying that's not an essential, but I think that the legislators and the people who are implementing the cannabis laws are probably really understaffed, and that's not helping anything.
You said something that I've been hitting on for the last 8 months, essential, right? Because here's Illinois. We're a little bit behind the Bay Area, where last December, it's illegal to walk around with cannabis. But here, 8 months later, it's not only legal, it's an essential business. And although it's an essential business, it's completely open. It's one of the few companies and businesses that are allowed to be open and needed to be open, yet they don't have the support and infrastructure so that they can function like a normal business. It's almost more difficult for them, whether you're a big establishment because you have your own growing pains or a mom and pop dispensary.
I think what makes it really difficult is these expectations. It's like, as I keep saying, that when healthcare people come into cannabis, what they have in mind, they have the whole mindset of how medicine works. Mm-hmm. And that just doesn't apply for cannabis. So I think that creates a lot of dissonance and a big disconnect. And I think people in the cannabis industry, they come in the cannabis industry and they say, okay, no problem, I know cannabis or I know business or whatever, and let's just get this up and running. And there's so many things that just don't exist that you would take for granted in any other industry. And the pieces just aren't there. And it's going to take a time. And what's also very interesting is each state is its own market. So you have no, cross-border stuff, or very little. You have multi-state operators, but they have very different regulations in each state. And so that's creating a lot of problems too. And this is all learning problems, and it's going to be chaos for quite some time, I think.
Mm-hmm. I'm afraid you're right on that one, Ruth. I see this going on because these compliance issues. Charlie Batchel, who's the CEO of Cresco Labs here in Chicago, they're an MSO, and they're in California as well, up in the Bay Area, and they're in, I think, 13 states. And he said one time when we saw him speak, that compliance is really the hardest part, and they want to be the darlings of compliance, which means the difference in every state is drastically different, everything from packaging to the laws to the marketing. And it creates costs that shouldn't be there if it were standardized in some way. But I think the states want to do this for the taxes more than anything. And when we get to the right place where the doctors can have someone that educates them, I'd love to hear what you say about that as an educator and a researcher, because the doctors, there's such a small number of physicians, and I talk to a lot of physicians, and many of them really don't have a great knowledge of the endocannabinoid system, or just CB1, CB2, the cannabinoids, how they work, how they prescribe. And I think that's an issue too, because if you get to a negative doctor that doesn't want to prescribe it for some reason and has a low opinion, it could be affecting a patient, I believe, in a way that would be maybe not harmful totally, but the patient could improve, I believe, if they had the right doctor that knew what he was talking about.
I absolutely agree with you. I think that there is possible harm going on, in that I think that there's a lot of people who are using cannabis medicinally but not telling their doctor because they think or know that the doctor doesn't approve. And so that's creating, drug interactions and a lot of complications, and that's certainly not good. I think there's a lot of stigma in the healthcare community against cannabis. And I've met, a lot of people who use cannabis. I've heard so many people say cannabis has saved my life. These are people with really major medical conditions whose lives have been essentially given back to them by cannabis. And one of them, for example, she's a TBI, traumatic brain injury patient, and she's had 6 TBIs. But her third one really messed her up, and she uses it, and she found it, and it literally saved her life. And she told me that she went to a doctor recently, and he said, "You're smoking it to get high." That, that's the only reason you're smoking it. Now, she does smoke it because she can't feel the effects any other way. And as a matter of fact, she just had her genetics done, and it turns out that her genes are such that she has a very high tolerance. So she needs to take a lot of it in order to feel an effect. And she's tried edible. She says, "I wish I didn't have to smoke it, but that's the only way that it seems to get an effect." And for a doctor to say to her, "You're only smoking that to get high," is a real discredit to the healthcare community, I think.
No, I agree with the topic. And Dan, you know this very well. For myself, I have ADHD and stuff like that, and I'm completely off Adderall and all that. And I hunt down very strong sativas, and that's a different effect. If I share one with a friend recreationally, they're going to get high. But my tolerance is high enough that I don't feel that same effect. And I'm getting that small percentage from each time I take it as a medicine, much differently than someone that is just taking it to smoke it once, like that doctor might have assumed that they were. That person, if they're taking it regularly, maybe every other 2 hours, whether it's someone that's treating for pain, they're receiving it a lot different because they're not getting that, that same psychoactive high that someone might. They're actually getting those percentages of the terpenes. They're actually getting those different cannabinoids that are involved with that. And, sometimes I hunt out certain ones because of that. And me and Dan always compare notes because we're really into what different strains have on the medical side. But that's a good point. The tolerance is what people don't really, point to anything. It's not the same with someone just taking one toke and getting high as opposed to someone that medicates themselves with a pack of joints throughout the day.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I definitely agree. And again, I think it's the stigma. It's really, really ingrained. And I think it's going to take a long time to really get past that. I think we need, as much education and as many people out there telling their stories. I like to say, there's the doctors always say, well, there's no good evidence. And actually there is a lot of good evidence. The problem is doctors are looking for random control trials. And the problem with large scale random control trials. So if you do a large scale random control trial, that costs millions and millions of dollars. And most people can't afford it. It's only the big pharma who can afford to do the random controlled trials. So it's kind of a catch-22 because none of the little guys who are trying to pioneer through with cannabis can afford to pay for those. But if they don't pay for them, then the medical community is not going to accept them. On the other hand, what I say is there's plenty of evidence. There's like billions of individual case studies out there of, how cannabis has saved people's lives. But unfortunately, the healthcare community doesn't accept that as evidence.
That leads me to, I listened to a podcast the other day by a guy named Tim Ferriss. You may know of him. He's from the Bay Area. He goes between there and Austin, Texas. But he was interviewing Andrew Weil from WebMD. And Andrew Weil was talking about his days at Harvard back in the 50s and 60s when he was smoking pot. And he was trying to get creative with it. He was trying to do research and how hard it was. And if you want to hear a good interview on somebody that was a pioneer in trying to do research and all the pushback he got from other physicians, other than, of course, Timothy Leary, who wanted to join him. And I think there's a lot of physicians that are doing some really cool research. If you're familiar, there's an Israeli company I really like called CannDynamics. And they all came out of Tel Aviv University, I believe they studied under Dr. Raphael Mouchlam. And in my mind, he's kind of the godfather of cannabis research, which I know you kind of feel the same way about him as I do, Ruth. He's a hero to me because of, imagine going in 1963 and telling the police you wanted some cannabis to do research. And it was kind of really taboo at that time. So I'm just really excited about where we're at. Hopefully we'll see the end of prohibition. And I talked to people on all continents, especially down in Colombia lately, and people in Uruguay, and they're doing a lot of research in Germany. So I've been talking to some of the folks from German scientists. And the Israelis still impress me the most as far as what they've been able to accomplish. And I wish that we could have some of their established drug compounds with cannabis and terpenes and cannabinoids shipped here. I think it would be far advanced from anything we're seeing today in the United States or Canada even.
I agree. They've had a good head start.
They have. And do you have any idea when this ban on researching cannabis might come down? Do you see any bright lights coming ahead that could change that?
Part of the problem is if researchers want to go through the formal route of doing research and complying with all federal law, they need to get their cannabis samples from a designated federal source. And
the University of Mississippi, right?
University of Mississippi, which, and I have this quoted in my book, some guy said that most of the stuff at the University of Mississippi wouldn't pass the test standards that are required for cannabis to be sold legally in the dispensaries. So it's all really bad quality. and it's very low concentration, low potency, and not a lot of terpenes or variety. And so this is what the researchers are being forced to use. Now, several years ago, the government came out and said that they were opening up licenses to other designated people who wanted to supply cannabis to researchers. And that was, I believe, 3 years ago or so. And to date, no one has been certified.
I know, you got to get the DEA out of this whole process, and really the FDA, because they big pharma controls the FDA.
Yeah. Well, it's slowing down so many things too, because of the hold. It's kind of like that triangle. Everyone has their hand on it. And even things like, okay, let's say your CBD goes too hot and you can't sell it as CBD. Well, there's this whole market as using it into plastics, the bio that you can use in the hempcrete and all these other things, but people are not sure about it. It's not that easy, because here's a little hand saying it's a drug, here's a little hand that's saying it's a commodity, and people are so uncertain. So there needs to be some, and I think we're moving towards that, but until it gets snuck into one of these bills that they're passing every day, I think we're stuck with it a little bit longer.
And I think it goes back to your what you said before, Ruth, that because it's so new and growing in North America and all over, there's not enough equipment that's automated to make it even more profitable to do specific things such as hempcrete, or build houses with it, or things that they want to do that it has great potential, but we just don't have the equipment that's been developed to make that a reality yet.
I heard that, I believe what I read is that the people growing hemp, so the cutoff there, at least in California, is 0.3%. I think that maybe that's for the country. Other countries have different cutoffs. But the hemp farmer, the grower, is required to test the batch before they harvest it. And something like 2 weeks before they plan to harvest it. And if it runs hot, if it's above 0.3%, they're required to destroy the crop, which...
And that's what I'm saying. Like, think about how much
thing you've ever heard of. Only politicians that are, policymakers and career politicians could do things like that. Make rules like that.
They could instantly make
you're a business person, that destroys you immediately. And I know what it costs, because I know a few hemp growers that were first-time farmers growing it that lost $500,000 to $800,000, $900,000 in one crop. That's a tough lesson.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, Ruth, we looks like I promised you in the beginning, that hour went by quickly. It looks like we went right through Q&A time and just kept on talking. But as Dan and I always, ask, we always like to ask our guests, if there's one thing that you can tell the audience out there, the cannabis enthusiasts, I mean, what would be that thing before we head out here?
I think cannabis is going to be the penicillin of the 21st century. I think the potential is so amazing. And I think, kind of tied in with this, a lot of people are saying, well, if you look at prohibition, or if you look at, they tried to legalize cannabis in the 70s and that didn't work. And like now, this time, it's not going to last. And I disagree, because I think the discovery of the endocannabinoid system has legitimized cannabis. And I think that it has so much potential to help so many people. I'm extremely optimistic about the future of cannabis.
Absolutely.
So I want to give you another plug. If you're listening, this is a great book. You can find it on Amazon. That's where I've got it. Is there other places to find your book as well, Ruth?
You can get it on our website at medicalcannabisprimer.com.
Great website, by the way. And then you also have the blog.
Have the blog there, yes.
And your Quanta site as well.
Yes, I have two blogs, one at Medical Cannabis Primer, and those are cannabis industry as far as, excuse me, medical uses of cannabis. And then at my Quanta, QUANTAA.com, that site has cannabis industry market dynamics blogs.
And if someone wants to get in touch with you, Ruth, what's the best way that someone could get in touch with you if they'd like to communicate?
They can email me at ruth@quanta, QUANTAA.com.
And we'll be posting a recording of this shortly after this, later this week. So we'll put all her websites, contact details, everything that you can, so you can directly contact Ruth, because at Green and Shy, we're here about resources. We're here about connecting people with those that they need so that they can get the resources to succeed, and we can be a good cannabis community together, because we have to pave the road together for it to be successful.
And Ruth, thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to the day I'm in the Bay Area and I can come over and take you out for coffee and meet you, because I think you're an incredible woman. You're doing some great research, and I think it's going to help the furtherance of this new industry to progress. And thank you so much for the time you've shared with us tonight of your profession and, you know, what you've been able to do so far. And I see a lot more coming down the pipeline from you with just talking to you in the past.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks, Ruth. And tell your brother Arthur, great job on all the photographs and the publishing side of it. He did a great job.
Thank you.
Good night.
Ciao for now.
Thank you for joining us, everyone. Bye-bye.